Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wilary Winn University. My name is Frank Wilary, and I'm one of the co-founders of Wilary Winn. For the past 23 years, Wilary Winn has been serving community-based financial institutions with the goal of strengthening those institutions. One of the ways in which we do this is by facilitating learning. Wilary Winn University is, at its core, a learning-based conference, one we created specifically to help community-based financial institutions become stronger, better-led institutions. Every session, every presenter, and every topic today has been chosen with one question in mind. What does our audience need to know to lead their organizations more effectively? The environment that you're navigating right now is genuinely complex. Interest rates, credit quality, regulatory expectations. The margin for error is thin. The decisions you're making today will shape your institution for years to come. We designed today's sessions with exactly that reality in mind. Doug and I are extremely proud of the entire Wilary Winn team and their many talents. This afternoon, you'll hear from our team and outside experts across 3 areas. Our first presentation will dive into hedging mortgage servicing rights, a topic that is always relevant given interest rate volatility. For this presentation, we have brought in longtime friends and colleagues from HedgeStar and Blue Rose Capital Advisors to share their experiences, along with Eric Knockin from Wilary Winn. Second, with Mike Tessier, we'll explore integrated risk modeling, bringing together asset liability management, CECL, concentration risk, and risk-based pricing in an integrated way across the organization to improve both decision-making and performance. As background, Mike's efforts are the driving force behind the high accuracy of the Wilary Winn models. And we'll close with a macroeconomic update and look at credit loss indicators with multiple presenters from the Wilary Winn team. So you'll leave today with a clear-eyed view of what may lie ahead. Our goal is simple. You will finish this afternoon sharper than you started it. Thank you again for being here. Let's get to work. I'll turn things over to Eric Knockin, a director here at Wilary Winn, to start our MSR presentation.
Thanks so much, Frank. Before we dive into the presentation, I want to go over some important information regarding how you can earn 1 hour of continuing professional education or CPE credit for this program. To earn full credit, you need to attend at least 50 minutes of today's webinar. Additionally, we will be posting 4 polling questions throughout the webinar. You must answer at least 3 out of 4 questions to earn full credit. Please note that you do not need to answer these polling questions correctly, and some questions may not even have a correct answer. Simply answering the question is sufficient. At the end of the webinar, a survey will launch. While you aren't required to complete this to earn CPE credit, we truly value any feedback you have. Your CPE certificate will be sent to the email address you registered with early next week. Lastly, we're happy to answer questions at the conclusion of our presentation. Please submit any questions you have in the question box. A brief introduction to Blue Rose Capital and HedgeStar. Hopefully, most of you on the site know who I am, but our Blue Rose and HedgeStar folks, Sam will provide some additional context later in the presentation. Blue Rose Capital and HedgeStar are affiliated companies where Blue Rose works with a client on developing and executing hedging strategy, and HedgeStar enters once the trades have taken place to assist with the accounting and reporting of the transactions. Sam is the managing director at Blue Rose Capital with more than 30 years of capital market experience. Sam helps guide his clients through complex transactions by making strategic recommendations based on sound, thoughtful, sophisticated analysis. Sam has advised and/or executed derivative investment transactions totaling more than $50 billion for financial institutions and other clients. Sam's expertise comes from serving as a structurer, trader, and marketer of interest rate derivatives and defeasance products at some of the largest banks and broker-dealers. Tim Potter from HedgeStar is responsible for coordinating and overseeing the delivery of all client services and serves as a subject matter expert in hedge accounting, financial instrument valuation, and technology optimization. In addition, he is responsible for establishing best practices and maintaining a best-in-class system of internal controls, along with an active role on the HedgeStar leadership team, including developing strategy and guiding the direction of the company. Welcome, Sam and Tim. We're looking forward to your presentation. We've included a list of resources related to MSRs that are available on the Wilary Winn website in our resources section. This is not a comprehensive list, but there are a number of the most popular MSR related items on our site. We are very proud of the white papers, articles, and tools that we've created. Everything we post on our resources page is available to download for free and is not gatekept. We do not require you to provide any information to us for you to download any document. As I'm sure you're aware, MSRs is just one topic that we cover, but you'll also find papers and articles about CECL, ALM, mergers and acquisitions, mortgage banking derivatives, and more. So in today's presentation, we're going to touch on a few different things. We're going to talk a little bit about mortgage servicing rights accounting. For those of you that attended our session 2 weeks ago, some of this will be a little bit duplicated, but other pieces will be new. We're also going to review the risk profile of MSR assets. At that point, I'll hand it off to Sam, where he'll discuss hedging the MSR asset using swaptions, and briefly touch on the potential costs of hedging the MSR asset. MSR accounting. As most of you know, when a loan is sold with servicing retained, the GAAP requirement is that the MSR asset is recorded at its fair value with the offsetting entry made to the income statement, generally in the gain on sale account. There are instances where an institution has built up a servicing portfolio but has not recorded the MSR asset. In that situation, we sometimes see the institution record an entry as a prior period adjustment to equity for the MSR asset related to loans sold in prior years. The MSR asset for loans sold in the current year will be recorded as income. Ultimately, the entire amount of the asset ends up in equity. It's just a matter of how much runs through the income statement. For situations like this, we encourage clients to discuss with their auditors to determine materiality and whether or not the entire amount should be recorded as income or if the entry should be broken out between equity and income. Moving forward, once cash is received, the income is recorded as servicing fee income. And once the initial journal entry has been made and the assets on the balance sheet, the institution needs to determine if they want to account for the asset using the fair value method or the amortization method, which is a low COM or lower of cost or market approach. Both methods are completely acceptable under GAAP. The option is solely up to the institution. We do want to note that once an institution elects the fair value method, that is an irrevocable election. Any institution that has elected the amortization approach, they can make a one-time irrevocable change to move to fair value. But once you're on fair value, you're on fair value going forward. Given that we're talking about hedging the mortgage servicing right asset, throughout this presentation, we are going to be focused on the fair value method of accounting. So hedging a portfolio can be different, and the fair value method will allow an institution's debits and credits to minimize the earnings volatility. Institutions not hedging under fair value will experience more earnings volatility. That's why the majority of our clients that are not hedging will choose the amortization method. But under the fair value approach, an institution should determine the fair value of their MSR asset at each reporting period. Generally, that's quarterly. The asset is adjusted to equal its fair value. So the asset's written up or down to its fair value, and the difference or any change in the fair value is taken through the income statement. As those of you that have servicing assets know, the asset can be fairly volatile, which is why institutions that elect fair value often hedge their portfolios. And as I mentioned before, fair value election is an irrevocable election. Managing runoff risk. So there's a number of ways to do this. As interest rates rise, originations generally slow, prepayment speeds slow down, and MSR values increase. Conversely, as interest rates fall, prepayment speeds increase and MSR values decrease, but generally originations within an institution will increase, and the fees associated with those originations will help to offset the decline in the MSR value. The operational/macro hedge can work over the long term, assuming an institution has the capacity to originate new mortgage loans when interest rates fall. A way to limit the impacts of prepayments is to retain the borrowers that return the loan and return that loan to the servicing portfolio. That's where the recapture strategies and initiatives come into play. To the extent that an institution is good at originating loans or good at recapturing their own loans, that will help to keep that portfolio sizable. The old loan goes away, but it's replaced by a new loan. So ultimately the fair value can remain relatively stable. Another alternative is you can hedge with positive convexity instruments. That's what we'll dive into a little bit later. And lastly, again, not really applicable for fair value, but an institution that's using the amortization approach can use appropriate amortization methodology. And that's going to bring us to polling question number 1.
So the polling question is, which accounting methodology does your institution use to account for their MSR asset?
We'll give everybody a minute or so to answer the question. Looks like we've got a majority fair value, which makes sense given our topic here, but a decent amount using the amortization, and just a handful that haven't recorded an asset or don't sell loans, servicing retained. And again, please remember, you don't have to answer the question correctly. You just need to answer the question in order to get the CPE credits. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. All right, so again, those of you that attended our previous MSR session, this might be look fairly familiar, but this is a slide that shows the negative convexity that typically exists with mortgage servicing rates. The graph represents a single 30-year mortgage loan with a 6 1/8 interest rate. As you can see, the value of the asset declines more in the negative interest rate shocks than the value increases in the positive interest rate shocks. When we look at the extremes in the plus 200 basis point shock, the MSR value increases by about 27 basis points when compared to the base scenario. However, in the down 200 basis point shock, the fair value of the asset loses 75 basis points of value. As interest rates fall in the negative shock scenarios, the ease with which borrowers can refinance has a big impact on the value of the mortgage servicing right, as expected prepayments increase significantly. In the down shock scenarios, the discount rate will also decline to help to offset the negative prepayment speed impact. But we at Wilary Winn implement a discount rate floor in our MSR valuations, so the offsetting impact only helps so much. Since mortgage servicing rights are essentially a modified interest-only strip, in other words, there is no return of principal when a loan pays off, the servicer's future cash flows disappear, which leads to the decline in value. Our previous slide was a graphical look at the negative convexity, but in this slide, we're going to focus on the negative shock scenarios. As you can see, if interest rates fall 50 basis points, the prepayment speed spikes by over 70% from 11% CPR up to 19% CPR, and the MSR fair value declines by over 28%. In the down 100 shock, our fair value is cut by more than 50%. And in the down 200 shock, prepayment speeds more than triple the base prepayment speed. And the fair value of the MSR asset declines by more than 63%. These significant declines in this one loan scenario lead to a big question. What is my portfolio's risk profile? As you saw in the previous slide, the fair value risk associated with a higher interest rate loan is significant. However, that's not necessarily the case for an entire portfolio. This slide details the same negative convexity that we discussed on the previous graph. However, we've broken this down. For a sample portfolio into 100 basis point interest rate bands. The sample portfolio contains just under $1 billion in unpaid principal balance and contains only 30-year mortgage loans. We focused on 30-year mortgage loans as they have the longest duration and therefore are typically the most volatile. As you can see in the negative convexity for the loans with interest rates less than 5% is pretty minimal as the lines are relatively flat. There's almost no upside and not much downside for these loans. You do see a bit of a drop off in the down 200 shocks for these loans, but all in all, there's not much volatility for these MSRs, even with significant changes in mortgage rates. The yellow line, which consists of loans with interest rates greater than 5% up to 6%, is interesting as there's very little movement in the down 50 shock, but then you see significant declines in fair value when you move to the down 100 and down 200 shocks. For the loans with interest rates greater than 6%, we see significant volatility across all scenarios. This graph shows where the risk is, but doesn't provide us with much income statement risk. So here we have our same 100 basis point interest rate breakouts as our previous slide, but we're looking at the actual dollars associated with the interest rate bands and the potential income statement impact of the interest rate changes. This will allow you to ask the question, what is our institution's risk tolerance? As you can see, the total income statement risk in the down 50 basis point scenario is just under $1 million, but over 3/4 of that risk is isolated in the greater than 6% to 7% interest rate band. When you move to the down 200 basis point shock scenario, the total income statement risk is almost $5 million, and 3.9 of that total risk is associated with the loans in the highest 3 interest rate band buckets. If we look at the total dollar impact of just the highest 3 interest rate buckets, that entails between 78.5% to over 88% of the total dollars at risk across all negative rate scenarios. This is where risk strategy comes into play. If an institution wants to hedge their MSR portfolio, they need to develop a strategy to cover the potential losses that exceed their risk tolerance. To the extent that an institution is able to recapture a good percentage of the loans in their portfolio that ultimately refinance, their risk really isn't the 5 million that we've indicated here. It's less, as they'll be able to replace those loans in the portfolio. However, as I stated previously, there are timing concerns between the MSR write-downs and the origination income, and there will undoubtedly be loans in your portfolio that will choose to refinance with another lender. All of these items need to be considered when developing a strategy to hedge the MSR asset. That brings us to polling question number 2.
Polling question 2. How concerned are you about your MSR portfolio if rates are to drop by 100 basis points or more? Extremely concerned, moderately concerned, not very concerned, or no concern?
All right, again, we'll give everybody a minute or so to answer the question. All right, looks like the vast majority are not very concerned to moderately concerned, which is, I guess, good. We don't have a lot of people that are extremely concerned. And those with no concern, obviously, they're sleeping well at night. All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll. And at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Sam to talk about hedging mortgage servicing rights. Sam, I'm going to give you control here.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. Okay, so backing up a little bit, Eric talked a little bit about the sensitivity to interest rates on mortgage servicing rights. I don't seem to be able to change the pages here.
All right, hang on. Let me try it again. If it doesn't work, let me know. I'll just flip them for you, Sam.
Sure. No, that doesn't seem to be working. Can you
Okay.
go to the next page? Sorry.
Yep, no problem.
Perfect. So again, just to rewind a little bit, what are mortgage servicing rights? That is simply fee income that institutions like yourself earn for servicing mortgages that you've already sold off the principal loans, the principal balances of each loan, but you retain servicing rights. So what that is, ignoring amortization and prepayment, that's just simply a fixed annuity stream of, let's call it 25 basis points a year on the outstanding balance of the mortgage. So like any other fixed income asset, the value of that is going to be subject to changes in interest rates. Generally speaking, as interest rates rise, you're going to be discounting that cash flow back at a higher rate, so the value is going to be a little bit lower. As interest rates fall, you're going to be discounting that cash flow back at a lower rate, so the value of that stream of cash flows is going to increase. But because these are mortgage servicing rights, the underlying mortgages that you're servicing are subject to prepayment. So generally speaking, as Eric pointed out earlier, as rates drop, people tend to refinance their mortgages, and so those loan balances get prepaid. And in an extreme case, if rates drop low enough, all of the mortgages might prepay. So while you have something working in your favor for lower interest rates and that you're discounting back at a lower interest rate, that value change is dwarfed by the sensitivity of the fact that the cash flow simply starts disappearing. And as rates rise thereafter, they don't go back. If rates drop rapidly and everybody refinances, and then rates start to rise again, you may not be able to replace that pool of mortgages, depending upon your market share, and your viability in your market, and how quickly people refinance or prepay their mortgages for for other reasons. So you're very sensitive to rates dropping and rates dropping precipitously, as the graphs that Eric shared with us earlier show. And it's that specific provision, because the mortgages tend to prepay and the cash flows start evaporating. That's what we refer to as negative convexity. You notice that it's not going up as interest rates drop and down as interest rates rise. It's actually the opposite, because the sheer amount of cash flow is what's driving the value rather than the discounting of those cash flows. So that negative convexity is something that we need to pay attention to and potentially need to hedge. Swaptions are a great tool for hedging this risk. But before we discuss how swaptions can be used and what swaptions are, let's back up a little bit and talk about what an interest rate swap is. Some of you have done quite a few interest rate swaps, as I understand, and some may have never done any interest rate swaps. Eric, can you flip to the next page? Perfect. So at first glance, a swap is simply a contract between two parties where each party agrees to exchange cash flows based upon a notional amount or reference principal amount. So in a fixed receiver swap, if your institution were to enter into one, you would enter into an agreement with a bank or a dealer in which you would receive a fixed rate payment from that dealer, and you would make a floating rate payment to that dealer based on the same schedule and the same amortization of that. So for a $100 million swap at 5%, you would be receiving 5% of the notional amount each year, and you would be paying a floating rate, let's call it SOFR. So whatever the SOFR rate is times that same $100 million. And those two legs of the swap would offset each other to some degree. And whatever the net payment is would be paid or received, depending upon where interest rates are, by one party or the other. This type of agreement is typically used to convert fixed rate assets into, fixed rate liabilities into floating rate liabilities, particularly for firms that want the convenience of committed funding so they can issue long-term fixed rate debt, but then swap it into a SOFR-based liability so that they can experience what they believe to be the positive cash flows associated with lower interest rates if those come to fruition, but while retaining the committed funding and not having ongoing support costs associated with their debt. Similarly, a fixed receiver swap will increase in value as rates drop, because your payment obligation under that swap is lower, and therefore you'll be presumably receiving more than you're paying, and decline as rates rise, because presumably you'll be paying more than you receive. That's not the profile of the MSR. That's not the opposite profile of the value of the MSR. Put another way, let's look at the mechanics of the cash flows for a fixed receiver swaption. In this case, if we look to the left of the diagram, your institution would enter into a swap with a dealer. You would pay an indexed rate, presumably SOFR, to the dealer on a periodic basis, and you'd receive a fixed rate from that same dealer. So if we look at what those cash flows would look like, as rates drop, you're going to be a net, what we would refer to as a net receiver. You're going to be receiving more than you're paying because you're paying the lower floating rate. But then conversely, as rates rise and they rise above, if and when they rise above the swap rate, you're going to be paying the floating rate higher than the fixed rate that you're receiving under the swap. So you're going to be a net payer. As I mentioned just a moment ago, in higher interest rate environments, that swap will have negative value to you, and in lower interest rate environments, that swap will have positive value to. It's a very powerful and very useful tool. However, it's probably not the right tool for hedging your MSR value. We go to the next page. Actually, before we go to the next section, we're going to introduce polling question number 3.
All right, polling question number 3. Is your institution currently using derivatives to assist with managing balance sheet risk? Yes or no?
All right, we'll give another few seconds for people to answer. Looks like pretty close to a roughly 60-40 split. So we'll go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, so before the polling question, we talked about what a swap is and why it's not the appropriate tool for hedging valuation risk with an MSR portfolio. A fixed receiver swaption, however, is. And so what is a fixed receiver swaption? Well, like a swap, it's a two-party contract between you and a dealer. However, looking at the last two syllables of the word swaption, it's an option on a swap. In that case, rather than payments starting automatically under a swap with a given set of terms, in this case, you would be a purchaser of an option, and your option would be to enter into that swap with the same or a similar fixed rate versus floating rate indices on a notional amount. You would pay a premium, generally speaking, upfront, but it is possible to have that premium paid over time. You would pay a premium to the institution to retain the right to enter into the swap at a time of your choosing. You may choose, depending upon where the market goes, you may choose never to exercise that option, in which case that option will expire worthless, through its terms, or you may choose to enter into it, or depending upon how the swaption is structured, it's possible that you could partially enter into it and partially enter into the balance of it at another time. So if we think about what a swaption is versus a swap, there's no change in cash other than the initial purchase price and the payment of the premium. There's no change in cash flows or exchange of funds between the two parties unless and until such time as you choose to exercise the option, if you choose to exercise the option. If you choose to exercise the option, there are two ways to exercise that. One is you could simply commence the swap that the option is subject to and start making or receiving payments under the swap pursuant to its terms. Or alternatively, you can cash settle the swaption, and by cash settling, I mean rather than starting to accrue payments back and forth between the two parties, whatever the market value is, and presumably the market value at that time would be positive, which is why you chose to exercise the option, the swap would be immediately terminated by the two parties, and the market value would be paid by the dealer to your institution. So if we think about that, if we purchase a swaption to enter into it, unless and until we exercise the option, there are no changes in cash flow. If rates go higher and higher, unlike a swap, there'll be no negative value because you're not obligated to make any of those payments in a high interest rate environment. However, if rates drop, then the value of the underlying swap that you have the right to control will increase in value. So it's starting to look a little bit more like the MSR graph that Eric shared with us earlier. That is, not much change in value or any change in value in a higher interest rate environment, but potentially significant change in value for the better in a lower interest rate or as interest rates fall. So at least we're starting to resemble something like the opposite of the MSR portfolio, but we're not quite there yet. And if we can go to the next page. So how would you hedge the MSR servicing rights? As I mentioned, if you purchased a swaption, you'll have no negative values in a high interest rate environment, but you'll have a increasing value as rates continue to fall. So that's as pure as an interest rate option gets. However, that option is an expensive option, and in and of it by itself, it's not the appropriate tool to hedge. And the reason being is if you think about your MSR portfolio, if 25 basis points is the servicing fee, what you're concerned about is preserving that 25 basis points irrespective of whether or not your underlying mortgages prepay or not, so that your cash flow is fixed at that 25 basis points. So if your mortgage portfolio completely goes away, the use of the hedge that you construct is going to still pay you your 25 basis point annuity. But as I pointed out, the swaption will pay an increasing value as rates drop. So if you're worried about rates dropping 150 basis points and you purchase an option struck 150 basis points lower than current market, the value of that hedge will start increasing. And once you get to that 150 basis points, you may think it's at maximum value, but when you get to that 151st basis point, you're going to receive more. And the 152nd, you're going to receive even more. And you're going to keep receiving a growing stream from the counterparty, your counterparty, the dealer that you're facing, all the way down to zero. So that could be widely advantageous to you, but it provides more cash flow than you need, and so therefore costs more. So the way we reduce that cost and make it more closely aligned is we would have you not purchase, but sell a second option back to the dealer. So the first option that you would buy would be an option to receive fixed, struck at the level where you're concerned about, whether it's 100 basis points lower than current rates or 200 basis points lower than current rates. And that trigger point is going to vary from institution to institution based both upon what their underlying portfolio looks like and how much it is at risk to changes in interest rates, as well as your own individual risk tolerances. But that said, if you purchase an option struck 150 basis points below current market, you only need protection from that 150 basis points down to 175 basis points or 25 basis points lower. So you would purchase that option struck at 150 basis points out of the money, and you would turn around and sell an option back to the dealer struck 175 basis points lower than current market back to the dealer. So those two options will more or less move lockstep with each other. The cost will be a little bit higher because you're purchasing an option with a higher strike, or one that starts paying a little bit sooner. So you're going to have a more expensive option. You're going to sell a slightly less valuable option. We'll talk about pricing and show you some examples a little bit later in the presentation. Back to the dealer. That premium that you receive from the dealer is going to offset the option price that you're paying to the dealer for the first option. But what's going to happen is as rates get to that strike price, you're going to start receiving basis point for basis point for the first 25 basis points. So you'll replace that lost servicing income through the swaption. But then if and when rates continue to drop below that point, the dealer is now going to exercise their option against you. And you're going to be paying them a fixed rate under the swaption that they purchased from you, but again, struck 25 basis points lower. So the net cash flow of those two positions will effectively become a 25 basis point annuity to you because you're going to be paying X and you're going to be receiving X plus 25 under the combined agreements. If we go to the next page, we can look at what that is mechanically. So again, your institution is standing in the middle, and you would purchase or be long a swaption, what we call swaption 1 from the dealer, where you are purchasing the right to receive fixed and paying floating if and when you exercise. And then at the same time, you'll sell to the option, they'll sell an option to the dealer where you're going to be paying them fixed and receiving floating. And those two floating legs will offset each other because you'll be paying and receiving the same index on the same reference notional amount. But those two fixed legs will be set arbitrarily, or by design, I should say, to represent the strike level at which you're concerned about your portfolio. And then the difference between those two will be your servicing fee, whether it's 20 basis points, 25 basis points, 30 basis points, whatever that happens to be. That's what's going to look like. So the net result of that, if we look at the graph on the bottom, the x-axis being interest rates, so in a higher interest rate environment, neither of those options are exercised. So you can see there's no cash flow associated with either of those two positions. Once rates fall below the trigger rate, you can see you're getting a growing income stream for each basis point that it falls below the trigger rate. But once you get to, in this hypothetical example, 25 basis points below the trigger rate, that cash flow no longer increases. It flatlines at the 25 basis points. So it is designed to replace the 25 basis point annuity that you would receive for servicing the mortgage portfolio, or the portion of the mortgage portfolio that you're most concerned about with respect to prepayment. So that's what the cash flows will look like. If we now look at what the value is, same graph, interest rates. What we have is the yellow line, is the net position. We have the value of the hedge as shown by the blue line, and the value of your MSR is shown by the green line. And for reasons relating to my graphics skills, those two lines are shown as straight lines. As Eric pointed out earlier, they're not straight lines. There's a fair amount of convexity or negative convexity associated with that. But those two lines basically above, in a higher interest rate environment, offset each other and net to zero. But below the strike rate, if you look at the yellow line, that yellow line remains flat. It won't be exactly flat because, again, that 25 basis point annuity that you'll be receiving will be discounting at a lower and lower rate as we get into lower interest rate environments. So it might not be flat. It might have a little bit of a curve to it where it'll go up by slightly for each basis point that the market rallies. So what does this look like in terms of numbers? So what we did is we took a look at the strategy that we talked about and put some pricing on it. And these numbers here, because of when we went to press, reflect basically a month ago's market, April 30th, 2026. These are mid-market values. They don't include dealer execution spreads. So they're a little bit more optimistic than you would actually achieve as of April 30th. And so what we did is we looked at a 10-year term and a 5-year term. And we looked at it both for an option that's 100 basis points out of the money, and for another option that's 200 basis points out of the money. So again, if you're concerned about, or start to get very concerned about rates falling more than 100 basis points, that 100 basis point out of the money structure would probably be the right approach for you. If your portfolio is a little less sensitive to that first 100 basis points in interest rates, and it really kicks in at 200 basis points, you'd probably be focusing more on the lower half of the chart, which is the 200 basis points out of the money. And again, this is not the only sizes or options that are available. These are just arbitrary scenarios. Ultimately, the term and the in the money or out of the moneyness of the hedge is going to vary from institution to institution. And it's something that both the Blue Rose, HedgeStar, and Wilary Winn team would love to work with you on to help you identify the right hedge for your particular needs. But going back to the baseline assumption, in the case of 100 basis points out of the money, if you were to look to do a 10-year term, you would purchase an option struck one to receive fixed, struck 100 basis points lower than the current 10-year swap rate. The cost of that option on a basis point per annum, not a one-time upfront, but a basis point per annum cost, would be just under 22 basis points. And to finance that, you would then turn around and sell back to the dealer a 125 basis point out of the money option. Because it's more out of the money, that's going to be a slightly less valuable option. So you would receive from the dealer roughly 17.5 basis points for selling off that second option to them. So the net cost to you for that 10-year term, 100 basis points out of the money, would be approximately 4.25 basis points per year. So your cost of hedging your mortgage servicing rights for a drop in rates more than 100 basis points would be approximately 4.25 basis points per year. Likewise, if you're more concerned about the 200 basis point scenario, same math, same everything, just different numbers. Your net cost for that would be 1.76, or a little less than 2 basis points per year, so approximately half as much. And then similarly, if you were concerned about, or your portfolio really only looking to hedge for 5 years, the cost for that would be a little bit lower. And the reason why it's not substantially lower is, believe it or not, given the shape of the yield curve, the 5-year swap rate at the time we ran this was actually higher than the 10-year swap rate. So the strike price for that option was actually struck at a higher rate, which made it a slightly more expensive option based on the rate, but less expensive based on the 5-year volatility versus 10-year volatility. So again, looking at these numbers, what it shows is for a handful of basis points per year, for most people who are concerned about interest rates falling with respect to their mortgage servicing rights, 100 to 200 basis points, by foregoing some of that fee income in terms of paying for a hedge, you could preserve that right. Ultimately, as Eric had pointed out, what the right strike price is and how much to hedge is very much a function of your particular institution. There's no absolute right or wrong answer. If you believe you would have 100% recapture for every mortgage that prepays, you might not need to do any hedging. If you're operating in a very competitive market where you have serious concerns about the ability to recapture some of the refinancing activity, or you lose more than you would originate, perhaps a hedging strategy is appropriate for you. And again, collectively, we would welcome the opportunity to work with you.
And Sam, one thing on these basis points, I just want to confirm. Like when we're talking 1 basis point, 2 basis point, 4 basis points, we're talking about the notional balance on the swaption, right? So
correct. So if you were hedging $100 million portion of your mortgage, you may have $1 billion mortgage pool, but you only need to hedge 100 million after whatever analysis is done. That 100 million would be the 1 basis point or 2 basis points would be on that 100 million, not on the full billion. So just on the amount that's actually hedged.
Perfect. Thank you.
So before we go to the Blue Rose and HedgeStar commercial, we'll introduce the next polling question.
All right, last polling question. What is the primary objective when hedging an MSR asset?
All right, and as we said, no, you don't have to answer that. This is the one, I think the one question where there's a right or wrong answer, but you don't have to answer it correctly if you want your CPE. All right, looks like we've got most of our answers. Offset MSR value changes from interest rate movements. That is correct. All right, we will close the poll.
Just a quick intro to Blue Rose Capital Advisors and HedgeStar. Blue Rose, where I sit, is an advisor. We are registered both with the SEC and the CFTC, as well as the NFA, National Futures Association, as a swap advisor. So what we do is we work with clients like yourself to determine hedging strategies, put policies and procedures in place, help negotiate ISDA and other swap-related documents, and then work with you to determine not only the structure, but to help you execute with a dealer or dealers to ensure that not only are you using the right structure, but you're also getting fair market pricing for the structures that you choose to use. So we work with you from inception, basically, to the word done. So once the transaction is executed, that's where Blue Rose's responsibility generally ends, and HedgeStar comes in. And what HedgeStar does is HedgeStar provides all the post-execution services, periodic valuations, hedge effectiveness testing, hedge accounting memos, et cetera. So Blue Rose and HedgeStar are affiliates. We're under common ownership, but we're two different entities with focused on two different parts of the hedge life cycle. Our contact information is here. If you have any questions or need any assistance, you reach out to any of us, or alternatively, reach out to your Wilary Winn representative, and they could get the ball rolling and bring us in as needed. Whichever way, shape, or form makes sense to work with you, we're interested in accommodating you that way. And looking at the clock, I think we have a few minutes for questions.
All right, we have one question for Tim. Can you provide us with a brief overview of the hedge accounting strategies, both day one and ongoing, for the hedge trades and MSR asset?
Oh, great. I do get a little turn. Thank you. Well, as any accountant would say, the first answer is it depends, right? And thankfully, we have a couple more minutes so we can elaborate on that. First, with the swaption itself, we have a net purchased option. Right? We've paid a premium, offset part of that with a net sold premium, but we have a net premium paid. So we start with an asset equal to that premium we paid. For the debit and credit nerds, we credited cash, debited an asset, simply a balance sheet entry. From there forward, as markets change, the swaption value will change, and its changes in value will be recorded in earnings. Okay? And as Sam alluded to earlier, while options seem more complex, one positive of this strategy is that, as mentioned, we know what our worst case loss is. We're starting with an asset, say of 1,000. We'll use small numbers. We know that the most we will lose is that $1,000 we've paid. And the value of that hedge will never go below zero. And as our MSRs start to lose value, our hedge will start to gain value and offset that. So using that as a little segue into the accounting for the overall strategy itself, really, as we're kind of talking about these details, the swaption harmonizes, if you can use harmonizing with the term topic of accounting, but it really harmonizes nicely with the MSR asset itself, as Eric described for us earlier. Rather than, I believe I heard hedge accounting in the question, but hedge accounting typically refers to an election you make to designate a derivative as a hedge and receive preferential treatment. In this context, we're taking the simpler path of quote unquote normal derivative accounting where we don't have to make that designation. And again, that is because of the way the MSR asset is recorded itself, right? So if we take the institution that has elected to fair value the MSR, changes in that asset's value are already recorded in earnings. When we introduce the derivative to the balance sheet, its change in value will also affect earnings, right? And again, when interest rates go down, the value of our MSR goes down, so we have a loss, but it is offset by a gain on the hedge, okay? So we have nicely offsetting components there from an accounting standpoint, and we can really mitigate the volatility that can be present when left unhedged. On the other hand, just one quick note on the institutions using the amortization method. Changes in that derivative may introduce some volatility, right? Because you're not always recording changes in value of that MSR through earnings. You're just simply amortizing the value through earnings systematically. However, if you do find yourself in the situation of, writing down the MSR value due to impairment, due to heavy stress in the market, it would be expected that that impairment loss is offset by the swaption gain to some extent, right? So you do have that benefit. It's just, when going the other way, as we all know, markets don't steadily go up or steadily go down. They're very helter-skelter, so you'll see little blips along the way. But in either context, you do have protection economically and some offset on the accounting side as well, without the burden of the hedge accounting process.
Thanks, Tim. That was all we had for questions.
All right. Sam, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And
thank
you everyone that joined us. And for those of you that are joining our next session, just a reminder, Mike Tessier will be covering integrated risk modeling. And you'll want to close out of this session and open the new session so that you can earn that CPE credit. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.